Good morning. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word. I'm Barry Bryson, and we're continuing our study, recommended reading, and I would like to recommend that you read the Gospel of Matthew, and that you read the Gospel of Matthew as a Jewish gospel. It's such an interesting um, work, Matthew's Gospel. Where would we be without Matthew's Gospel? We wouldn't have the Sermon on the Mount without Matthew's Gospel. Um, there are just so many details that we would not have apart from having Matthew's Gospel. Matthew's Gospel, of course, is one of the three synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which were written at around the same time, probably in the 60s AD. In other words, a whole generation after the events, um, but earlier than John. John, who wrote his gospel kind of to fill in the gaps and to expand upon what the first three had written. And each gospel is unique in its personality, in its view, in its particular audience. And Matthew's audience will be Jews. Jerusalem is going to be destroyed at the end of the revolution, the uprising of the 60s. And Jews are not going to be allowed to live in Jerusalem, for a long time. And it's going to be leveled in the way the Babylonians had leveled it 500 years before. That's going to happen. It hasn't happened yet when Matthew writes his gospel, and he's writing to a people who need to know definitively that Jesus of Nazareth is the Messiah of prophecy. And so Matthew's gospel is written to that audience, and I believe written quite evangelistically to convert Jews to believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. There are so many things in the Bible that make this, in Matthew's gospel, that make this clear. Let's talk about Matthew as an author first. Only Matthew tells us his name is Matthew. Um, Actually, when he tells the story of his conversion in chapter 9, he is the only one who calls himself Matthew. Both Luke and Mark call him Levi. Now, because his name is Levi, he's almost certainly from the tribe of Levi. And yet, we also know from all three Gospels that Matthew was working as a highly placed commissioner of revenue with the Romans in Capernaum, which was the cash flow center of Palestine at the time. And that's who he was. One might wonder, and we don't know the answer to this question, why would a young Levite man become a collaborator with the invaders, with the occupying force of the Romans? We don't know the answer to that question, but that's who he was. We should not be surprised, however, that such a tax collector could produce this gospel if he was not just good at accounting, but also a Levite and trained, had a Levitical training. Whoever wrote this gospel clearly had a priestly Levitical training, and that's who Matthew was. We start the Gospel of Matthew with this highly stylized genealogy that traces Jesus back through Zerubbabel to David to Abraham. Abraham and David are important because the two covenants that God keeps in Jesus to bless all humanity and to establish David's throne forever are fulfilled in Jesus. And so this is important. We also have in Matthew's gospel, more than in any other gospel, the fulfillment of prophecy. Before we get to the Sermon on the Mount, we have 6 major prophecies fulfilled and quoted in full in those first 4 chapters of Matthew's gospel, and that goes on and on and on throughout. Matthew has organized his gospel around five major sermons that Jesus gives. Why 5? Well, how many books of the law are there? There are 5. He uses Hebraisms in the way he expresses himself. In other words, he acts like a man whose writes like a man whose primary language is Hebrew, although he is writing in Greek. And so he will use uh, phrases that we're familiar with in the Old Testament. He also um, makes sure that we see Jesus observing the law over and over again, going to the holy days and not necessarily in any way bowing to Pharisaic rabbinic tradition. He's not a Pharisee; he's a Levite. But obeying the laws of Moses Levitically, being an observant Jew at the same time as being Christ's Messiah. And if we read the Gospel of Matthew this way, we allow Matthew to connect for us the Jesus of the New Testament back to the prophecies about Jesus in the Old. Last time we were together, when I introduced the Gospels, and I said the whole Bible is about Jesus. The whole Bible exists to communicate Jesus because Jesus himself is God's communication. Of all the Gospel writers, Matthew is the one that makes that clear. He's the one who rivets the Old Testament to the New Testament and makes us understand that, as Jesus will say in the Sermon on the Mount, I did not come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. Now that it's fulfilled, we go on to what God has promised next, which is me, the Messiah, and the age of the Messiah. If this is such a central notion in all of Scripture, and Matthew um, quite reasonably sits at the very beginning of the New Testament because no other writer, with the writer of Hebrews, there are sections of Paul, but no other writer really, riveting is not even the good word to use because it's like bolting two things together. They are not two things, they're one thing. God's will, God's plan, God's arc of our salvation. And and Matthew is the one who makes it clear that the New Testament and the Old Testament are one thing together, and that Jesus is the binding factor. He is the thread that runs, the vein, the root that runs throughout, that holds everything together. And so I'd like to recommend Matthew to you, but read it in that way. Okay. Next time we're together, we'll talk about Mark. Thank you for joining me for another 5 good minutes with the Word.